This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
As well. I'm looking forward to the time I'll be spending informative for everyone, and opens your eyes up to a new facet of the property industry that has an enormous amount of opportunity, and I think is, and I'm biased, but I think is one of the most fascinating aspects of the property industry out there. And I'll explain why over the time we spend together. So I'll share my screen. So just wanted to confirm, can you give me a thumbs up if the slides are showing?
Not yet, Toby.
Okay, hold on. I'll just have to quickly give my... Just gonna rush to the device settings.
No worries. Do let me know if you want me to upload the slides for you or share the screen.
That might be one option. Let me just have one quick go.
Yeah, it will give you more control if you have it open at your end.
It's a nuisance. Okay, so I think I'm there, but I might just have to quickly log in and out to
Okay,
make
sure.
it happen. Let me just check. Although I'm more optimistic by what I'm seeing.
I think we can see something. Yes, wonderful. It's working.
Oh, good. How's that for working under pressure? Okay, so we're all under control. I'll begin by introducing myself. My name's Toby. I was in a similar position to you not long ago, and before I start, I should start by saying that you should all be very proud of how you're going about it during a difficult time as university students. I was at university not long ago myself, and it was nothing like the experience that you were having, in that I can't imagine what virtual classes would have been like, but I think you should be very proud of what you're going through, and while it's a different experience, I wouldn't think it's an inferior experience at all. It's a challenge, and from all signs, it's likely to be a bit of a new normal in terms of how we go about things. So congratulations to you all for remaining positive and continuing with your studies in light of that. And I'd also congratulate you on picking the field of property and doing so at Melbourne. I think it's a program and a discipline that I've benefited greatly from, and it's also a very, I guess, a pragmatic one in a way, because it has so much breadth and opportunity, not just from an academic and an intellectual standpoint, but also from a career standpoint. So that's why I'm pleased to be able to expose you to a new facet of the property industry today and my experience. But I started as an undergraduate student at Melbourne in 2014 and enjoyed the property program there. It was combined with a range of other activities as an undergraduate student, but I won't delve into those now. But I was largely focused on my studies, which I enjoyed. I did a bit of part-time work as a student at the Property Council of Victoria, which is the chief industry advocate for property, and they do a lot of lobbying on behalf of the property industry and its members to ensure that the property industry has a political and market framework that guarantees or ensures its success. Because if the property industry is doing well, typically the economy is doing quite well, because it is such a large contributor to that. So that was quite an interesting insight into that aspect and the policy that underpins the property industry. And I did that during my final year. And then I was offered in my final year of 2016, but to start in 2017, a opportunity at the Coles head office as part of their graduate program. And to be honest, when I first put my application in for that, it was a bit unknown. I didn't really appreciate the interest that Coles had in property at the time, but it was a graduate program. It was a company that I was familiar with, and it was ticking a few boxes as well in terms of being close to home and being something exciting and new. So I put my hat in the ring for that and was successful in being accepted, and then started in 2017 as a graduate. To be honest, I got about 6 months into work, full-time work, and thought this can't be what I've signed up for the rest of my life. So I got a bit restless and thought I'm learning a lot in the workplace, and it's great experience, but I wanted to keep exploring the world of property. So I signed up to the Master of Property program about halfway through 2017, and I definitely felt vindicated for doing so. It gave me a whole lot of new insights into aspects of the property industry that I wasn't getting being primarily focused on retail at Coles. It allowed me to sort of pick and choose assignment topics and tailor assignments to new aspects, so that I was continually learning and applying those skills. And some people think I'm joking when I say this, but the introduction of GIS, being introduced to GIS at uni, fundamentally changed my life for the better. I tell the now former academic that he changed my life, and he's humbled by it. But I really enjoyed learning about GIS. And were it not for university and having some examples of work I had done in GIS, I wouldn't have been able to get a role at Coles in that field. So after spending a bit of time as a graduate and studying simultaneously, I rolled off the graduate program into Coles's leasing team. And that was in the liquor division. So Coles, as I'll talk to in a moment, has a pretty sizable interest in retail property, and in bottle shops we have Liquorland, Vintage Cellars and First Choice. So I was responsible for Victoria, South Australia and WA, and rolling out new stores and doing deals and negotiating with landlords and pulling together the business cases for new stores in those states. After about two and a bit years in that role, there was an opportunity in a GIS role, which was still within the property umbrella, but much more analytical rather than negotiation and deal based. And I had a go at that. And like I said, I had a lot of work I'd done at university in that regard to show to the head of that team to say, I've got experience here, give me a go. And they did. And that coincided with the start of the pandemic. So I didn't really have much else to do. So I did a lot of work and a lot of training in GIS. So I was producing a lot of output at work, which they were happy with. And 12 months later, they've given me another opportunity in that team to manage a group of about 3. And we're responsible for all of the space growth strategy and the location planning and what we call the network plan and subsequent sales forecasting for all future Coles proposals. Now, all that sounds probably a bit foreign and jargonistic at this stage, but hopefully by the end of this lecture and the next lecture, it all makes more sense and it's been pieced together. So that's a little bit about me. I guess the key messages are that I was in a very similar situation to you not long ago, and I thoroughly enjoyed my studies, and it was a really great opportunity to work, but also try new things and experiment with new things while studying. And while it took a toll on my my social and physical health, I'm definitely better for it. And commend you all for doing the same. What I'll talk about today, and what I'm keen to cover is a little bit about coals, which may be a bit indulgent of me, but I think it's interesting, and hopefully you can think of similar retailers, and you'll appreciate how integral they are to modern life. I want to talk a bit about property in the marketplace, the retail property industry, how retail property operates at Coles. Then I'm going to really focus on the location planning side of things, and what is location planning, what does that mean, and what do we do. There's a bit of theory, just a little bit at this stage. I think I'll focus more on theory next week. And then there'll be quite a strong emphasis on the practical application of that theory, creating what's called a network plan, and how that network plan is pieced together, how it's utilised by a retailer, and what it does. So that's a broad outline. I just want to check at this stage if there's any questions. And that I'm coming through loud and clear.
All this looks great, Toby. Maybe we'll ask students if they have any questions, and otherwise we'll keep moving. Yeah.
If there's anyone who shops at Woolworths on the call, I'll have to ask them to jump off, because I'm unwilling to cooperate with anyone who shops at Woolworths. Hopefully everyone's a Coles shopper.
Well, for that, we need to make sure that there is Coles in radius of 5 kilometers of all suburbs.
Correct. And without having those numbers at my fingertips, I think it's about 80+% of the population who are within 5 kilometres of a Coles and a Woolworths. So much of the population is covered off in that regard, as given we're so densely populated, and that there's quite a large presence of both Coles and Woolworths stores. But if there's not one, that's my team's fault, and I'll have to fix that. So happy to hear from anyone who's in that situation after. So just a bit about Coles. I suspect it's known to everyone. It's got more than 100 years of history in Australia. And I guess what I find quite enchanting about retail is that it's really a people science. Retail, in many respects, reflects society, because that's what it's there to serve. And it started in 1914 on Smith Street in Collingwood. And if anyone's familiar with that store in Smith Street, Collingwood, the current store, that is not the same store, but it's the same location as where the first store was. So that's a fun piece of trivia if you're ever in that part of the world. That was known as a variety store at the time, so it served a few different purposes, but the first fundamental Coles supermarket opened in North Balwyn. And again, if you're familiar with that site at the intersection of what would be Burke and Doncaster Road, that is the same site and one of the oldest Coles supermarket, but one of the oldest Coles sites in our fleet, oldest enduring. So that one has a rich history to it as well. And in 1977, we opened our first Bilo store I'm not sure if anyone remembers Bilo's, but I certainly do. And that was historically a Coles subsidiary, and that they eventually disappeared from the Coles fleet. And I'll talk to that in a moment. But as Coles grew as a supermarket chain with Bilo's and Coles rolling out across the country, they also started to expand as a bit of a conglomerate, meaning that Coles, the company itself, started to acquire other brands, and it was quite a large company serving different purposes with different retailers. So over time, they acquired Kmart. They added liquor to their remit with Liquorland and Vintage Cellars. Quite a significant moment in Australian business and retail history was the merger of Coles and Myer, which occurred in 1985. I know at my parents' generation, they still refer to Coles as Coles Myer. It's just in their mind as what it is because that's what it was for so long. And the Coles Myer group would deploy either Coles stores or Myer stores, potentially both in some shopping centres, but it was all the one company, albeit with different divisions within it. Coles Myer then opened Officeworks, which was again serving a different purpose, but all of these brands under the Coles Myer group were increasingly popular because they served that non-discretionary use. Everyone has to go to the supermarket. You know, everyone needed office supplies then, probably more so than they do now. Everyone likes to go to the bottle shop, or most people like to go to the bottle shop. Kmart served a purpose as well. So Coles Myer really became an institution because of people's dependence on the products that they provided. You know, if you had all of these brands in a shopping centre, it would have been a pretty useful shopping centre. So they did roll out far and wide, and they had the ability to pick and choose what brand they'd put where for what purpose. So that first Officeworks opened in Richmond. Coles started to play in fuel, Coles Express, which again is just another example of how this brand, everyone who drives a car needs to buy fuel. So you can see how this retailer is gradually sort of inculcating every part of society that people need. It's serving that purpose. So there was that shift to fuel to meet that need for more non-discretionary uses being served. Coles then expanded into the large format liquor space in 2005 with First Choice Liquor. So as opposed to your Liquorlands and Vintage Cellars, which are just small, convenient shops that are typically next to a supermarket, so that when you're done with your supermarket shop, you can walk into the bottle shop. They opened up large format liquor stores, which are typically about 1,000 square metres in space and normally stand alone. But the first one opened in Taronga, which is next to a Coles and next to the head office in Hawthorn East there. And then again, the next two events of 2007 and 2018. In 2007, Wesfarmers acquired Coles Myer, which was significant. And still to this day, Wesfarmers own Officeworks, Kmart, Target, and a number of other retail aspects. But from 2007 to 2018, they owned Coles and all of those other brands that were a part of the Coles Myer group. But in 2018, they decided to demerge, spin Coles Liquor and Coles Express off from Wesfarmers and listed on the ASX as a separate company. And there was a bit of discussion about that at the time as to why, and there's quite a lot of media literature out there about the reasons why they did it. But fundamentally, they felt that supermarkets, they aren't really able to achieve extraordinary returns, but they achieve very consistent returns over time. You know, they will typically always grow in line if there is population growth. But Wesfarmers had done pretty well at turning Coles around. In 2007, it wasn't in the best shape as a supermarket retailer, and they had an amazing transformation over those years. They'd achieved good returns. It was at a point where it was flatlining because there wasn't that scope for above market returns. Supermarkets are very capital intensive because they're quite expensive to build. Like I said, they don't achieve a major return, but if you achieve a small return across 800 plus stores, then it does add up. So they figured that they could, I think the statistic at the time was that they spent about 60% of their capital on Coles, but it was only responsible for about 30% of their revenue. So they felt that they could divest this business and then redeploy their capital to a use within their conglomerate that achieved better returns. So I don't know for sure, but I think those two transactions in the broader marketplace of Wesfarmers buying Coles Myer and then just over a decade later delisting Coles were two of the biggest in Australian corporate history, which is why I think they're interesting. And as you can see from the brands that are involved, it has touched so many different aspects of Australia and its population in the purposes that they serve. So that's a bit of retail history, particularly relating to Coles, which I find fascinating. Today, there's 800 Coles supermarkets, and there are 900 liquor stores, and then there's 700 fuel sites across the country, which just talks to the breadth and the scale of Coles as a business across the country. Our annual report came out, the summary of our annual report came out last week for the last financial year, and our total sales are at about 38 billion. Our EBIT, earnings before interest and tax, is 1.8 billion, which is huge. And then the net profit after tax, which is really the bottom line, we're at $1 billion. So Coles as a company achieves a profit of $1 billion, which is quite significant. As a standalone company, we floated at about $12, $11, and in 2 years we've grown at about 50%, which is great news for shareholders, and vindication of what Wesfarmers has done in a sense. Now that Coles is able to focus as a supermarket chain, and Wesfarmers can focus on their respective business units. You can see in this table down the bottom here that a very large proportion of our revenue, of that $38.6 billion revenue, the vast majority of that comes from supermarkets. So that's looking like about 85% to me at sight. Liquor's at about 3.5 billion, and the express is very a very small component of that, just because we don't worry about the fuel. We worry about the sales of goods inside the store. We're not selling the fuel, we're selling the products inside the store. So that's a bit of a summary of last year's performance and our scale as a business. I remember someone did something similar to this in one of the lectures that I attended as a property student, and I'm not going to do it as well as they did, but nonetheless, I thought it was interesting, and we might have a look at this in the workshop later, just how much of an emphasis that retailers have, and not just retailers, but also a number of major Australian companies, large Australian companies, have an interest in property, whether it be land and buildings or property, plant and equipment. It is a significant component of most of their balance sheets. Just to use a few examples here, BHP, they've got $38 billion worth of property, plant and equipment. That's probably skewed towards the plant and equipment given the heavy machinery, but nonetheless, they own a lot of land, which is then excavated, and then explicitly the land and buildings part is close to $8 billion. And when they own land, they have a lot of different interests in the economics of that land, the uses, the value, and a number of other considerations that form part of land. And that's just an example of a mining company, whereas you can look further down the list and see that both Wesfarmers, Woolworths, and Coles, which are retailers in many respects, have a large interest in property. Sydney Airport is in the industry of airports, but in many respects it's a big shopping centre. Whether they're leasing space to retail outlets or they're leasing terminals to airline operators, they're in the business of space and valuing space and providing space. And similarly with Ramsay Healthcare, which is for all intents and purposes a pharmaceutical and hospital company, hospitals are grounded in location and property, and so are the pharmaceutical outlets that they have within their remit. A few other examples in this list, like Goodman and Scentre Group. Goodman is a large industrial player, and they have a humongous exposure to land and buildings and property, plant and equipment, because that's what they do. They own industrial space and they develop it and they lease it. And that's the same with Scentre Group. Scentre Group is the management company for Westfield shopping centres. So Scentre Group and Westfield can be used interchangeably, but they are the owners and operators of Westfield assets in Australia, and their core business is shopping centres. And that's why so much of their value is comprised of land and buildings, because that's what they do. So that's just a bit of an exposure to that. We'll have a look at some annual reports later, and we can come back and deliberate over what the different strategies or tidbits contained in the annual reports to do with a company's property and land exposure is. But just thought I'd remind everyone that most companies have an interest in property in some way, shape or form. That's just two examples there, which we'll hone in on later. To have a bit more of a focus on the retail property industry, and I might be telling people things they already know, but this is not something I really appreciated until I was a property professional myself. But the retail property industry is really comprised of landlords and tenants. To sort of crudely segment it, it's in retail property, you're a landlord or you're a tenant, but there's also examples where you can be a bit of both. From the landlord perspective, that's an aerial image of Chadstone. So from Chadstone's perspective, that's got a slightly different ownership structure, but that's owned by a company called Vicinity Centres. They're the largest retail landlord in the country, and it's also 50% owned by a private high net wealth individual called John Gandel. But Vicinity own 50% and they manage the asset. So they are the freehold owners of that land, and they also manage the asset in the form of determining who the tenants are, what the future sort of development and growth strategies of the development are, how the tenancy mix should change over time, all things to do with the car park and other maintenance related issues are all within the purview and the remit of the landlord. Then a different view is that of the tenants. So while you have a broad shopping centre, the tenants are the ones who take up the space within it. They occupy the space, the certain square metres within the tenancy that is allocated to them, and they operate the shops. And importantly to the landlord, they pay the rent. So a landlord values space. They are interested in how much space they've got and how much people are willing to pay for that space. And the tenants are the ones that have to make a rational decision about how much they're willing to pay. And that's typically based on how much they think they're willing or able to achieve in sales and other aspects from that space. So tenants are the ones that occupy the space and operate out of it. As a sort of transaction, they're the ones that pay the rent to the landlords in exchange for the benefit of that space, which is customers and sales. I use McDonald's as an example as a hybrid, but there are other hybrids out there. McDonald's is a very large owner of space. So McDonald's, some people will tell you that they aren't in the core business of selling burgers. They're actually in the core business of property development, because what McDonald's do is they'll go and buy the land that they operate out of. They'll develop the restaurant, so they'll manage the development. They'll get a builder, a principal contractor to help develop the restaurant. Then they've got a decision to make. They can either hold on to that asset, the land and the restaurant that's just been developed, and they can operate it as a company, or they can sublease it to a franchisee. And if they've got the land at the bottom level, they own that, they've developed the restaurant, so they are the landlord, they will put in place a franchisee who operates the restaurant and will be the tenant. So then McDonald's receives rent in the form of a lease from the franchisee. They'll put that lease in place, and they'll have some standards that the franchisee needs to adhere to in the form of presentation, so they can maintain quality control. And then they'll normally have in the lease a clause that gives McDonald's a percentage of sales from the amount of sales that the store achieves. And then there's also franchise fees. So in that type of scenario where they're the landlord and the freehold owner of the asset, and there is a franchisee in place, McDonald's isn't necessarily getting money from selling burgers. They're getting money from collecting rent, franchise fees, and a cut of the sales that the franchisee achieves through the lease. So that's just an example of how they can be a landlord and a tenant. And in some cases, they don't always own the land. They can buy it, develop it, or they can just straight go into a leasehold arrangement, either before they've purchased the land, because it's not practical to purchase the land. If they're in a shopping centre, they'll just go straight to a lease. Or once they've sold it, they will lease it back to themselves as a company, or then to a franchisee, and that same process ensues where they collect the rent from the franchisee, the franchise fees, and the sales from the store. So I understand that's quite complex. That took me a while to get my head around, but it's just an example of how you've got landlords, the shopping centre owners, or the asset owners, tenants, the people who occupy the space, but then there are operators who do a bit of both. So that's the conceptual example there. And here's the examples that I just gave off the top of my head. So landlords are, it could be a mum and dad investor who just want to own an asset with a supermarket. But there's also the institutional retail landlords like Vicinity Centres, like Centre Group, Charter Hall, which has more of a diversified portfolio as a company, but they've got quite a big interest in retail. And then there's APN Group. That's just an example I gave. They're an example of an unlisted retail landlord. So they're a private fund as opposed to a ASX listed company like Vicinity, Centre Group and Charter Hall are. Tenants, which isn't a too difficult concept, but just to reinforce the point, tenants like Subway, Sushi, Cotton On and Dimmicks are all examples of people who demand and occupy space within shopping centres. And then some more hybrid examples on top of McDonald's are Harvey Norman. Harvey Norman has that same approach where they typically own the land and then franchise the operation to a franchisee who then acts as the tenant. And Harvey Norman, the company, doesn't primarily sell white goods; they collect rent, which I remember when I did an assignment on that, was a fascinating revelation to me. And I never look at a Harvey Norman store the same. And Woolworths and Coles, we are also examples of hybrids. We are overwhelmingly tenants, but we also are landlords in some situations. So Woolworths does the same, but I'll talk from Coles's perspective. So in some growth areas, we may buy land with a long-term view to when the residential component of that precinct is developed, it'll be ready for us to build a supermarket. So we'll buy the land with a long-term outlook. We'll wait for the residential population to come online. Once we've got the residential population, we will develop the supermarket while we own the land. We might just build a freestanding supermarket where it's just a Coles and a Liquorland, or we might build a shopping centre where there's a handful of other tenants, maybe 5 or 6 other tenants, which would classify it as a neighbourhood shopping centre. And we'll put those tenants in place. We normally like to have a few fresh food operators, a cafe maybe, a nail salon. We'll put all of them in place with a lease, and then we'll open the Coles, open all of the supporting tenants. We'll let the shopping centre operate and the supermarket operate for a few years. And then once it's up and running, we'll typically sell the asset and do what's called a sale and leaseback strategy, where we may have purchased the land, 10 years ago for $10 million. Once we've developed it, which cost us $5 million, we've spent about $15 million on this. Then once the supermarket and the centre are open, we'll be in a position where we can put it to market. You will have done the income capitalisation approach. We'll be able to sell it as a strong long-term asset, which is anchored by a Coles, and that's achieving anywhere from a 4.5% to 5.5% cap rate at the moment. And we'll typically sell it for a profit on top of what the holding, purchase and development costs have been. And then we'll use that surplus capital as then something that we can help to develop or help to facilitate our next acquisition. So it's called recycling capital, and that's very effectively done through the sale and leaseback strategy. So that's just an example of what we do, and Woolworths do the same. Any questions on the retail property industry and my high-level summary of it?
It was a great summary, Toby. Let's invite questions and yeah.
Toby, I just got a quick question in terms of the right when you say the recycling capital part. I was just wondering whether when you sign a contract to buy a land, do you have like a negotiations already taking place for the future owner to buy like the big listed companies? Does that often happen, or does it happen like once I develop it, then only I look for owners to buy it?
As in when we look to sell it?
Yeah, once you operate it for a few years and looking forward to sell it as a whole.
Yeah, it can vary who we sell it to. Normally, it's because the shopping centre is a bit smaller. It doesn't have as high of a net income and isn't normally of as much interest to the institutional investors. We normally our purchases typically are that private investor, because the price point's a bit lower. There's more people who are willing to put in a bid, and it's a very secure asset. We have long leases, and it's a reliable non-discretionary defensive asset. So Charter Hall has quite a large portfolio of neighbourhood shopping centres, whereas Vicinity and Centre Group, they're much more focused on those bigger, what would be defined as major regional and super regional shopping centres. So they don't typically look to acquire what we sell, primarily because what we sell are freestanding neighbourhood and at biggest at sub-regional size. So some institutions do, some unlisted funds take an interest in our neighbourhood centres, but typically the scale and the size of our assets aren't big enough to meet the needs of a larger institutional investor. It's primarily the mum and dad, you'd call them mum and dad private investors who like to have a Coles asset or a Woolworths asset because they just sit there and achieve a return that's consistent over a number of years.
All right, cool, awesome, thanks.
Thanks for your question.
I had another question. I guess it's along the same lines. I was wondering more on why Coles kind of develops their own, owns and develops their own properties. Like, would it be more profitable to use that in your core business of like supermarkets? Is it kind of like just because of post GFC where you guys had the better bank balance and you could get better rates, or
that's exactly right. So supermarkets are cash intensive, and they're very counter-cyclical. So they're not counter-cyclical. They're just highly defensive. When things are going well, supermarkets are doing fine. When consumer sentiment is down, I think history would suggest that supermarkets do better. So they're very defensive asset classes, and I don't think I'm breaking a state secret by just saying that based on my observation, we did go on a bit of a shopping spree for land around the GFC because that's when land was a bit cheaper. We have a lot of cash to be able to acquire land, and it's not as much of an encumbrance if it sits on our balance sheet because we don't have high holding costs compared to that of a private investor with more pressure from a bank. But you make the right point that there is always a bit of a tension within the business, if you like, where the question is asked, are we in the business of selling baked beans or are we a property developer? And when the debate is had, people typically say, no, we're in the business of selling food. We don't want to do property developments, so let's focus on our core business. So we don't do a massive amount of property development, but when we have done it, it's been successful. And I guess given what we purchased land for a while ago and what the yields are at today, it hasn't been difficult for our developments to turn a profit and enable us to recycle that capital. But property development is expensive, and there is always that question of, is it the best use of tens of millions of dollars among competing uses within the supermarket chain?
I see. Okay, thanks. That cleared it up a lot.
Good questions. Now, I'm having too much fun talking about this, and I'm barely getting through the slides. So let me get a wriggle on. I just want to quickly talk about Coles Property, and I guess Coles Property it's a process. The property process is pretty straightforward and pretty consistent, but it can always change, and you can always play a bit of snakes and ladders based on how things transpire. So I'd just quickly say that the Coles Property team is broken down into several groups. There's the retail property team who do the leasing and development. They manage the relationship with those institutional investors, and they primarily deal in the supermarket and liquor space for those leasehold arrangements. The investment management team, they're the ones who do the freehold feasibilities for should we acquire the land, once we've acquired it and developed it, when should we divest it, and have we turned a profit to then facilitate those future acquisitions. The lease management team, they're the ones that pay our rent as tenants. That's the outgoings, things like the electricity, the statutory outgoings, the land tax, property taxes, and things like all of the different constituent parts of outgoings that are levied by shopping centre owners. We've got a team that very heavily scrutinise that to make sure that we're not paying any more or any less than we should be. And then they're also the ones that at the point where our lease or tenure comes to an end, they're the ones who are responsible for making that decision or pulling together all the information that helps Coles make the decision as to whether they should stay in that location, should they relocate, or should they close. Property legal, we've got a very very sharp and very effective legal team who sit within property, who help us with legal documentation and making sure we're not doing anything wrong or we're not being taken for a ride, and they also help us interpret the leases when there's ever a point of dispute between us and the landlord, which there can occasionally be. That's in those leasehold situations. Property finance do a lot of the feasibility on whether we should proceed with a proposal or not. A lot of modelling. It's I said there the CAR model. That's what we call a capital allocation request model, and it's a bit of a hybrid between a DCF and a P&L, which says here's the sales you're going to achieve every year for the next 10 years. Here's the anticipated gross profit of the supermarket sales. Once you deduct the employee costs, any sort of store overheads and the rent and outgoings, here's the EBIT, forecast over 10 years. Once you discount it back using our weighted average cost of capital, here's the NPV, here's the payback, and here's the lease adjusted return on capital. And based on those metrics, we can pretty much make a decision about whether we should proceed or not. But of course, there's a lot of other qualitative property strategic factors about why we'd want to go somewhere, which are used in juxtaposition with the financial outputs. And then importantly, the location planning team is the team that I'm now in, and we set the network plan. So we look at the entirety of Australia, and we look at our existing fleet of stores. We look at things like where the population growth is, where we have good performing stores, where we have poorer performing stores, where the competitors have good performing stores, where we aren't existing. And we figure out across Australia, where do we want to be where we currently aren't, or where are we going to want to be in the future? And that acts as a real foundation stone and template to help the property team look for sites in those locations that we've advised we want to be in. And once they've come to us with those potential locations in the geographies we've said we want to be, we give advice, and we also do a sales forecast. And that sales forecast is then what goes into the feasibility. And we work very closely with finance as well to understand, is this proposal going to be viable based on all of the inputs that we know today? So they're the teams, and based on each of the input that those teams provide, the starting point is always the network plan. Where do we want to be? Based on those areas that we want to be, say that area is, broadly speaking, it wouldn't be this broad normally, but for the sake of the example, if it's Geelong, the property team will go and look in Geelong. They'll identify a site where we want to be in, where we could be in Geelong. They'll negotiate terms. They'll secure an agreement. We will have done the forecasting for sales on that site. So once we've got the sales, the finance inputs for the line items to do with things like gross profit and employee costs. We add the agreement factors, which is the rent, which is a major line item. That gives us the ability to have the feasibility. We'll piece that together with the finances and the broader business case as to why we want to be there. We might say that there's a lot of growth expected, we've got low market share, and the competition has a very strong performing store there. So all of those things combined with a strong CAR model, which says the financials are likely to be successful based on the assumptions we've made. We'll take that to board. They'll hopefully give it the green light. The store will either be developed by the developer or us if we're the developer. We'll fit out the supermarket. We'll open it. Shortly after it's opened, we review the performance. The store might be open for about 5 or 7 years, and then we'll decide to refurbish it with the latest store concepts. Then the tenure of the first term might come to an end after, say, 10 or 12 years. We've got to decide, is this store still making a satisfactory return? If it is, we'll stay. If it's not, we'll go. When we go, we can either close it all together or we can try and find an alternate site in that location which is better and going to provide us with better returns. So that's a very rushed and high-level assessment of the typical retail property process and how it unfolds at a retailer like Coles. And all of these teams using this sort of Gantt chart in a way contribute to this property process in one way, shape or form, and involvement and others sort of provide their advice and then step back. But most have to have a fairly holistic view of the whole process and understand where things are at. So that's an example of that. Now, the best team is the location planning team, and that's the one that I'm in. And as I said, the main contribution that we make is in that form of the network plan. And like I said, it's where do we want to open new space? When do we want to open it? Is it right away if we could in 5, 10, 15 years? How big do we want the store to be? Does it need to be a full line store, or can it just be a compact store? What do we think the sales will be? And also, what are the impacts to our existing fleet? Because it's rare, like I said before, there is a very high density of Coles and Woolworths stores, particularly across the eastern seaboard and in inner metro areas. So when we open a new store, it's very rare that we don't impact our existing fleet and that there isn't some form of cannibalisation, which we've also got to be mindful of, because we will typically only assess a proposal on a post-impact basis. So after we've taken away impacts to our existing store fleet, what is the return once you reduce that impact? That's the fundamentals of the network plan, and that's something that we monitor very closely and push out to the property team. And we have to get a large amount of buy-in on that from the wider business. We support the property and store development teams in preparing their business cases. We provide a lot of the data. We're a very data-driven team, and we use a lot of GIS, which I'll explain later. We work across all brands, whether it be supermarkets, liquor, Coles Express and Coles Online. And we also, importantly, look at PIRs, the post-investment reviews for new space. So we're in the business of forecasting. We can't always predict the future with absolute certainty. So it's important to us to be very transparent with what we said the store was going to do once it's opened, how it's performing relative to that forecast, and if it's over, why, if it's under, why, and we hold ourselves to account on that regard, and we're very transparent about it in the interests of continually learning and improving. We We also do a lot of competition intelligence in our team. We collect a lot of information on what the competitors doing, where they're opening new stores, how big those stores are, how long it takes them to open a new store, where they're closing stores. We are very focused on that too, in the interests of comparison, but also it's just handy to know. I think I scare my team a bit when it comes to the property intelligence. I recite a lot of excerpts from the book The Art of War, which is a good book if anyone has some spare reading to do. It's all about knowing thy enemy, and that's certainly something that's important in a very competitive and constantly innovating retail landscape like Australia's. We provide inputs for the corporate plan based on how many openings we tell the business that we think we're going to have over the next few years, how many openings we think Woolworths are going to have, and that helps them plan for future performance in the corporate plan document, which typically takes a 5-year view. And like I said, we are the custodians of all competitor intelligence and demographic information, and the demographic information is another thing we take very seriously. We both rely on ABS data, but also we purchase a lot of relevant demographic data to help us make better decisions. I might keep this one for next week because it goes to the heart of theory, and if anyone has time to watch it in the interim, I don't know if the hyperlink will work. Maybe not. Either way, I might pull that up next week, or we can watch it in the workshop. I'll give that some thought. But this is where we start to talk about theory and the decisions that retailers and even shopping centre owners and developers make when they're deciding where they should put their store. Location's obviously paramount, and there's a lot of science and strategy that can go into where you locate and why. And I think the most rudimentary and quintessential example is that ice cream stand on a beach scenario, which I was always taught from a young age, but hopefully it's not foreign to everyone here. But we can run through that next week, just because it's taking a bit more time to run through things than I expected. So that'll form part of the theory next week, and that is hotelling's law too. So let me cover that next week. I'll quickly touch on agglomeration economics because, in my view, that's sort of chapter 1 in the textbook of economics, retail and urban economics. Agglomeration economics is really fundamental to that. Agglomeration, for those that aren't aware, is the collection or mass assemblage of certain property types in this context. And the reason that firms do that is because they benefit from co-locating. Excuse me. That's just a colleague probably wondering what I'm doing and why I'm not working. Too busy having fun here. So the reason why they co-locate is they benefit from having a larger pool of skilled labour. If all of the firms are in the one place, then there's going to be more talent in the one location, and that is why they are benefiting from having more choice. When you have firms co-locate, that also helps the suppliers, the middle firms that service those firms locate as well. And that's where, if you have a large employer in one location, it then benefits the firms that supply to that firm to be closer. So that's where you really get those flow-on effects from having one firm locate, which is very large in scale and size, because other support firms will want to locate nearby, and that's when you can really start to develop a cluster. And there's also what's been described as a local knowledge spillover. So when these firms are either intentionally or unintentionally crossing paths and their employees are crossing paths, there's that positive externality of more interaction and shared knowledge. which is a benefit of that agglomeration. And Alfred Marshall is I think the godfather of agglomeration economic theory for a spatial and location-based context, and they're the three main benefits, the trinity of agglomeration economics that he first advanced in 1920. Retail agglomeration, and I should say, I always like to think the best example of agglomeration, albeit some would argue that it's waning in its significance, is the Silicon Valley is a really good example of a mass cluster of tech uses which now have an extraordinary pool of skilled labour, which, you know, a lot of other firms have decided to locate there because they've got access to all of the firms that they could potentially be servicing. And then, you know, as a result of all those firms being there, there's a flow-on benefit to residential property, cafes and restaurants, and that's where there can be that spillover in more of a informal sense versus firms actually collaborating more because they're closer. So the Silicon Valley is a really good example of that agglomeration effect in action, and that's a fascinating topic, and there's a bottomless trove of literature with regard to agglomeration economics. In a retail sense, the example is probably epitomised by high streets like Chapel Street, but also shopping centres are in and of themselves an example of an agglomeration of retail uses. And the reason why they have sort of gained ascendancy and sort of primacy in retail is because it benefits shoppers a lot to limit the costs of the trip that they have to take, both in the form of time spent and travel distance, and they also have the ability to compare. So if all of these retailers are located in the one place, customers or potential customers don't have to travel as far to go to the individual stores, and they can also go, well, you know, a chicken sandwich costs this much here, but 2 doors down it costs this much, therefore I'm going to save money by being able to compare this and go with the cheaper option, all else being equal. So this high street effect and also the shopping centre effect are examples, very basic examples of retail agglomeration, and they have come about, I guess, both from a endogenous and exogenous perspective, because that's what customers want, because everyone wants to save time and cost in the form of travel. So that's the example of spatial concentration of retail, which is really, retail and urban economics 101. How am I going for time? I wanted to quickly talk about the notion of the anchor tenant. So historically, there's an interesting, Frank Lowy is I think he's the godfather of Westfield and the founder of Westfield, and he famously said he would never open a shopping centre unless he had Myer guaranteed as a tenant. And of course, Myer, I think it's an amazing brand and I've got a soft spot for it, but they have, if you look at their share price, had a lot of difficulty over the last few decades. They've struggled to sort of differentiate themselves. They've been hit hard by online retail, and Myer is definitely a brand that's experienced significant space contraction over the last decade as opposed to space growth. They're not opening many stores. They're downsizing stores to improve profitability, or they're closing stores because they have non-viable stores. So historically, something like Myer was always seen as an anchor tenant, and that anchor tenant is called anchor tenant because they're deemed to be sort of what holds the supermarket together. They're of crucial importance to the overall success because they draw people to the shopping centre, and they force people to have to also walk past those non-anchor tenants, the more specialised shops. People have to walk past those in order to get to the anchor tenant. So that's how the anchor tenant serves its purpose in a shopping centre. They're typically non-discretionary, things that people have to use, because if you have something that people have to use in your shopping centre, people are going to go there. They're typically larger and will take up more space than other tenants, and you can see that here in these centre plans. The boxes that are more of a darker purple shade and even a lighter purple shade are those major tenants, anchor tenants, or mini major tenants, which are things like a chemist or a more of a larger sort of fashion store maybe. And then there are the smaller grey boxes, and they're the specialty tenants. And then the really small ones are the kiosks, which is like maybe a thing that does iPhone repairs or a Boost Juice or a sushi. So that's how space is sort of allocated within a shopping centre. But normally the more space you take up, the lower rent you'll pay on a per square metre basis. And the specialty tenants take up less space, but they pay a premium, a higher rate per square metre to be there. And they'll normally pay more rent relative to their proximity to the anchor tenant, because if everyone's coming to this centre to go to Coles and you're on the doorstep, everyone's going to walk through or walk past your front door to get to the Coles. So landlords will say, if you want to be next to the Coles or the anchor tenant, you'll have to pay a bit more because you're going to have the best exposure of anyone. That can also work with the doors. If you're closer to a door, you'll have to typically pay a bit more because that's what everyone uses. And tenants will normally want to know what percentage of your total customers come in this door or this door or this door. And then they'll help make their decision about where they want to go accordingly. But that's how space is competed for within a shopping centre. It's quite an interesting dynamic for a shopping centre owner. And hopefully when you're next in a shopping centre, which may not be soon, but hopefully it is, you'll be more aware of these dynamics at play and understand why some shops are located where they are. You'll see in these maps here that it's not uncommon for, and this is a constant negotiation that our retail leasing team has to have about where in a shopping centre we go. If it's not our shopping centre, if it's a landlord or developer's shopping centre, we have less say over where we go. But as an anchor tenant, we can push for a certain location. Now, typically, we'll want to be as close to the car park as possible because that's where our customers want to be. They want to go in, go to the supermarket and get out. But a landlord will want to probably have us as far from the car park as possible so they can make sure that everyone walks past the specialty shops and then gets to the Coles. So normally we'll try and settle somewhere for halfway in between. But you can see at these examples, there's an entrance based on the entrances in both of these cases here. So there's an entrance point here and there's an entrance point here. The main car park is where the label is. People have to walk in, walk through, past all these shops to get to the Woolworths, and then here you've got to walk past all these specialty shops to get to the Coles. So that's just an example where the anchor tenants are positioned in a way that may not be convenient for customers to get to the store, but it does sort of maximise the foot traffic for the specialty tenants, and then may in turn increase their chances of viability and success. So they're just some more dynamics, but the notion of the anchor tenant is really central to a shopping centre. It's very rare that a shopping centre exists without one, and that they are really the barometer for success. If you've got a very successful supermarket, you're likely to have a very successful shopping centre. I might just take a breath and have a mouthful of water. I will happily open the floor up to any questions, but what I'm going to talk about next is just the creation of a network plan. So happy to hear from anyone, but otherwise I might just catch my breath. When I get excited, get to breathe.
I have a question about those anchor tenants.
Go on, you can.
So basically, like, there's only maybe one or two large place in a shopping center that could accommodate Coles. So does that mean like Coles couldn't really choose wherever they want to be, or are they involved in the development phase of the building to say like I want to be here? Or...
Well, it can vary. If we own the land and develop the shopping centre, we will decide where we go.
Yeah.
But we can't be too dogmatic about it because we want our specialty tenants to succeed as well. So it's really a trade-off. You want the supermarket to be accessible and successful, but you also want the supporting tenants to benefit as well. So it's got to be a situation that benefits both. So it's a bit of a dynamic. So if we're building the shopping centre, we can decide, but we're always going to be conscious of wanting the other tenants in the shopping centre to succeed as well. If it's a separate private investor or a landlord who is developing the shopping centre and they're asking us if we want to be in it, they will typically dictate where we go, but we can have some say in that. And of course, we don't have to accept it. If it's a very poor location, we can say, well, no thanks.
Yeah, and maybe I'll add to Yukian's question and what Toby just shared. You are right in saying, Yukian, that at times anchor tenants are involved early on in the decision-making process where the anchor store location could be. And many a times they are also given the benefit of rent-free durations. It all depends on where the market is and who is in a negotiating position. Is it the tenant or is it the landlord? So if the landlords are in a weak position, like for example, many shopping centers that were developing after the GFC or were in the process of development during the time of GFC, many rent-free durations were extended to invite more lucrative anchor tenants. And so anchor tenants were also involved are usually involved in the development process if they have a significant presence in the market. And I'm sure Toby will have much more experience of the Australian market. And it can vary for across geographies and within Australia as well. Yeah, so as he's saying that probably they can be involved at different stages. Also from the landlord's perspective, Toby, if let's say a shopping center is already designed to have an anchor tenant, and that doesn't put because there is not too much competition when it comes to getting a tenant for a large store of the size which Coles will be. So do you think it gives some negotiation power to the retailers who are potential occupiers of anchor store spaces?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. You're right. That's the reality that if it's a shopping centre where Woolworths already exist and they're offering us space in it, well, it's unlikely that Woolworths is going to open a second store in a shopping centre. So we know that we have reasonable negotiating power there. But it can change very quickly if it's a former Myer or David Jones site that's closing, or a Target, many of which are closing, and there's neither a Coles or a Woolworths. If it's a competitive negotiation where both of us want to be there, that's a very favourable position for the landlord to be in to extract value. But you're right in saying that there aren't many other candidates for anchor tenants for neighbourhood and sub-regional shopping centres. Australia, unlike the UK, has two supermarkets. The UK has many, which means that it's a lot more competitive, and I guess there's more of a benefit towards the landlord in terms of the choice that they have among competing supermarket operators.
Yeah.
Cool. So hopefully I can get through much of this. It may be a tad rushed, but we can reinforce it next week and through the workshops. But like I said before, a network plan is the beginning. That is really the guiding light in terms of where we want to be, and whether you're an existing retailer or whether you're a completely new retailer, you want to have a network plan which really just provides some science and detail and some rigor as to where you want to be and why you want to be there. So I'd be very surprised if retail chains or brands with a large sort of footprint, or even a small footprint, didn't have a network plan of some sorts within their organisation, because it's really quite essential in understanding the future growth and the rationale behind that growth as a business. The first thing I'll talk about is just the 9-step process.
We are losing your voice a bit, Toby.
I've broken it down into 9 boxes, and the steps that we would typically take as goals in order to devise a network plan in the interests of confidentiality, also how we go about this. And part of it's chopping up a bit, is it?
Yeah, maybe if you can repeat the network plan part, we don't want anyone to miss on that. That will be helpful.
Just let me know if it still breaks up, and I can turn my my video off.
It's good.
So I guess
maybe good idea to turn off the video for a while.
So I guess sure. So fundamentally, yeah, this is really the cornerstone, the foundation stone of any retailer's strategy from a space perspective, and most retailers and brands will only be able to grow from a sales perspective in the form of more stores, and the network plan just helps them to grow, and when they're growing, make sure they're maximising their chance of success by going to the right locations, and being able to justify why. So we've broken it down into 9 boxes, 9 steps in order as to how we go about it. I've taken a bit out just to avoid revealing all of our secrets from a confidentiality perspective, but also just making sure that we cover all the general concepts in these 9 steps, which we'll do. So the first one is the context setting. That's where you'd start with the network plan. You want to understand where the bulk of the population is in the country. As we know, that's in cities, in the more dense locations of Australia, particularly on the eastern seaboard. Where's the population growing? Now, interestingly, population since the beginning of the pandemic, the current headline statistic on that matter is that Australia has 500,000 people less today than we expected we would have 2 years ago. So the pandemic has resulted in 500,000 less people than we had hoped 2 years ago. And 80% of that shortfall in population has come from an absence of overseas net migration from to Melbourne and Sydney. So those two cities, which are historically a large source of migration, are now much smaller in population size than they expected. So that's, for example, the drop-off in population you can see from a national perspective, at least the drop-off in growth across Australia that's occurred since the pandemic. So that's something we're monitoring closely, but it's not all doom and gloom, because what has been happening, and this may not come as a surprise, and it's all in the public domain, the ABS reports on it, is that while the population has been declining or growing at a much lower rate, areas of certain states are increasing in population because there's been a big flow from capital cities to regional parts of Australia, where the people are going down to their holiday homes, where the people were so fed up of being stuck in their apartment that they've decided to go and have a complete sea change to the countryside or the beach fronted locations. While at a headline perspective across all of Australia, our population is lower, certain towns and regions are seeing population growth. So the headline statistic is deceiving, because somewhere like Queensland has had a big population increase. A lot of people have gone from Victoria to Queensland and New South Wales to Queensland. So we really segment it as much as we can and try and go into as much detail as we can to understand not just what the headline statistic is telling us, but also what the what lies below the surface and where the opportunities are for growth, because that headline statistic can sometimes be deceiving. Population is really fundamental to all things retail, because without customers, you're not much good. You can have the best looking store in the world, you can have the best store manager in the world, you can have possibly the best product in the world, but if you're in the middle of the desert, it's not going to do much good. So population is important, and locating relative to population growth and an existing high population is paramount. On top of that, we've got to have a good look at who the competitors are, where the opportunity is, where there's little competition, where are they, where aren't they? And then also we need to look at what the competitors are offering. If we're identifying somewhere as being populous with a big growth projection ahead, if there's a competitor there, if we're going to come in, we need to make sure that we're offering something equal and better. So they're the upfront considerations from a context perspective. Can you still hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you good. Thanks.
Great. So once we've got a feel for the context, we will approach this question with a bit more of a quantitative lens, and we do what's called a hotspot map, and that's a generic term. It could also be known as thematic mapping, and how we do that is we use what's called a scorecard approach. These are less theoretical and technical terms, more sort of practical, dare I say, industry or Coles terms, where we select variables that are strongly correlated to the success of a store. So the higher the population density, typically the higher the sales. The higher SFA provision per 10,000 people, SFA being selling floor area. The selling floor area is really just the shop floor, excluding the back of house. So if a GLA of a supermarket is 4,000 square metres, that's what you're paying rent on. The shop floor might only be about 2,800 square metres of that. So that's just where the groceries are. We look at the selling floor. So how much selling floor area is there per 10,000 people? That's just a metric, and normally the less selling floor provision per 10,000, the better a store does because it has less competition. And then the CEFA, which is an ABS score, which is the socio-economic index for areas. It's a number that ranges from, I think, about 800 at the lowest to 1200 at the highest. That's just a way of giving a number to a geography. And that you have a CEFA for an SA1 all the way through to a CEFA for a suburb. How do you quantify the affluence of that location? They're just 3 examples of variables that are typically positively correlated to the success or sales of a supermarket. So every SA1 has a population density based on our knowledge of competitors. Every SA1, we can give what the provision score is, and we also have a CEFA for the SA1. We can apply the variable to every single SA1, and then we can also say, all right, well, if the population growth in this case is deemed to be low, medium, high, or very high. If it's low, give it a 1. If it's medium, give it a 2. If it's high, 2, very high, 3. And then you'll have a situation where you've got every SA1, you've got the categorisation of growth, density, CEFA, and then you've given it a score, and then you just use an Excel formula to give it a score for its relative value. That helps you sort of start to segment all of the SA1s based on their relative attractiveness to a supermarket. And once you have every SA1 in the country done, you're able to then create a map where the darker colours are the more attractive areas, and that gives you a more sort of visually appealing way of understanding where you want to be based on variables that you've chosen and analysed as being successful for a future supermarket location. Of course, the variables that I've chosen can vary. They're very generic ones, and supermarkets can afford to be generic because we're trying to appeal to the entire population. But if you're a baby bunting store and you're looking at your network plan, you want to know where the young families are because they're your customers. So you're going to have a different set of variables. You're going to have a different set of scoring for those variables to make sure that you're bringing to life and really highlighting those areas that are the most important to you. Similarly, education level, if you're a retailer that's specialising in something that appeals to a more educated or intellectual crowd, you'll want to have that variable in there as well as density and maybe affluence. And then things like petrol stations are interested in what mode of transport people take, where are they car dependent, and they might throw in another variable to do with how many, they might buy a data set from a company that tells you what the traffic counts on certain roads are, and they might be able to pull that into the model. So you can really pull whatever you want in and then give it the scoring that you see fit. But this is just an example of how you can start to condense the list to make sure that you're really honing in on the best areas. And that's something we do to develop a hotspot map. I hope that's clear, because that's a really important and I find it a very interesting concept. And hopefully I'll seek to trial one of those in next week's workshop. But if it seems daunting now, it won't next week. But it's a bit of Excel analysis and it's a bit of data cleansing. But it is very straightforward to then produce something like the map on the right-hand side from what I've said. So hopefully that seems within the realm of possibility for everyone. Once we have an idea of where the gaps are or where the concentration of locations with a higher score is, we put it in a GIS and on a map, and then we ask ourselves if it makes sense. So if we're just objectively looking at everywhere that's attractive, we may already have stores there, so it's not appropriate for us to put a new store there. We might ask ourselves, where's the competition? And here's an example where you can see that's the Melbourne City, where, are we going to be locating closer to a Coles store, or are we going to be positioning ourselves in the middle of several competitors, which is probably preferable in terms of cannibalisation and maximising our chance of success. And then once we have had a look at the gap, the competitive landscape, that's when we can really start to understand, well, if all of the stores around here are only 1,000 square metres, we don't need to come in with a store that's 2,000. Maybe we just need 1,200 square metres, because that will give us a superior offer to the competitor. We won't have to pay too much more in rent, and we'll be able to achieve, adequate sales from that space, given that, the competition is a bit smaller. There's always a risk from a retailer's perspective. If you're coming in second to market, you want to make sure that you're providing something that's equal or better. Otherwise, people won't change their habits unless the location is suitably more convenient for them. So that's an example of the considerations when you're selecting a gap to test. One thing we'll look at in depth next week is the gravity model. So that's a statistical model that helps predict the probability of consumer behaviour, the relative attractiveness of a location, based on the competition that's available. So a gravity model looks at things like population density. They look at the road network. They look at the current competitor landscape and the size of stores, and it gives each location an attractiveness score based on the size of the store and its distance to the relevant areas. What you can then substitute that attractiveness score with is a potential sales forecast. If it's very favourable in terms of its attractiveness, and you know that there's X population and Y estimated spend per head of population on supermarkets, you can place a probability score on that population times that amount they're willing to spend on a supermarket. You can place that towards the location that you're proposing and get an assumed forecast of what the sales are, and then based on the proposed location's attractiveness versus surrounding offers, you can also estimate what the impact to those surrounding existing stores will be from a new store coming online. So we'll look at gravity modelling in a bit more detail next week, and I know Piyush has done quite a good reading on similar modelling of consumer behaviour in I think it was in Japan. And that was more of a travel model, but very similar concepts to a gravity model there. So that's something I can refer to next week. So that's how we get a bit of a feel for the attractiveness and the sales of the gaps that don't yet exist, but if they were filled by a future store in that location, this is what we roughly think it would do in sales, and this is what the impacts would be to the fleet. We've got to review and test each gap. Fairly mundane slide, sorry, but the examples of how we do this were a bit more technical and specific to what we do, but it's really just a matter of asking ourselves, is the computer right here? We're placing our human lens on it. Do we really want to be here? Similar to what I said before, is there already a Coles here? And sometimes the computer may have missed that because it was strictly looking at, attractiveness rather than existing competition. And then there's also the important aspect. We might say to property, go and open a store in the Melbourne CBD that's 1,000 square metres in size, because that's what our model tells us. But they'll say there's no space that's available for 1,000 square metres in Melbourne CBD. And if it was, it's going to cost us a fortune. So sometimes, in spite of what the gaps from the available information that I've mentioned suggest, it's not always deliverable from a practical property perspective. But nonetheless, what we've put forward is objectively an example of a location where there's a strong population. We probably have low market share. We think we would be able to get suitable sales and low impacts from this location. But unfortunately, the theory is trumped by the practical realities that it's not immediately deliverable in the short to medium term based on the market or the property or other constraints that exist. So that's something that wouldn't necessarily remove it as a gap, but you've always got to be conscious of, you don't want all your gaps to be that facing that situation. As I said, with a bit of help from the gravity model and also the human lens, we apply those selling floor areas. Like I said, if we're first to market, we have a bit more freedom to choose our destiny, whereas if we're second to market, we have to be a bit more conscious of what the competition has. If we're going into an area with a smaller population, we may be the first to market, and then it will stop a competitor coming in for a number of years, because it just won't be viable for 2 stores to operate in a town with, only a few thousand people. It'll be fine for 1, but if 2 come along, 2 supermarkets are there and there's only a few thousand people, it's going to mean there's 2 ordinary supermarkets. So sometimes getting in first to market can give you freedom for some time to come, because there just won't be a population for some time to sustain 2 supermarkets. And one thing that is worth considering, and is something that banks look at a lot now and retailers are reporting, is their sales density. And that's an important consideration. That tells you what sales are being achieved by the store on a per square metre basis, which is really just a measure of efficiency of the store's performance. The sales density is just the total sales of the store divided by the selling floor area, and that can be at a store level, or you can say the whole fleet has an overall sales density of total company sales divided by total company selling floor area. And as long as that's heading in a positive direction, that should typically be viewed favourably. Sales brackets are then sort of assigned. We don't give an exact dollar figure up front. We'll say it's normally between this million and that million, and it's supported by those different mechanisms that we've described. And then we'll give that so that property can go away and early on in their negotiations, without us having to do a full forecast, they'll be able to understand, here's what we roughly think the sales will be, so we can do a bit of a ready reckoner, a back of the envelope forecast on how successful this store will be based on the estimated other inputs of rent and employee costs and all the other aspects of a store's feasibility. And of course the impacts on by opening this store, what are we going to take from the existing Coles stores? So that example here is, if we opened a store in the middle of Burwood, right there, we're going to be impacting Vermont, the Glen, Burwood East, and the store to the north there as well. So we've always got to be conscious of what the impacts will be. And that also helps with the feasibility and what are called the net new sales, which is gross sales from the store minus impacts. We'll do a national sense check on stores and gaps. So you really want your stores to reflect the population. So we wouldn't want to have the majority of our stores in Tasmania and the Northern Territory and the ACT and have very few stores in Victoria and New South Wales. We should have the same proportion of our fleet. If Victoria has 25% of the population, we should have 25% of our population 25% of our stores in Victoria. And similarly, with gaps, you want the bulk of your gaps to be in locations where the growth is going to be. So if all of the growth is going to be in Queensland, you'd want the majority of your gaps to be in Queensland. I know that sounds very straightforward, but it's just an important way of checking. Once the computer's spat out all these gaps, it's a way that we can just have a look at them in a different way and ensure that we're maximising our chance of success for these stores and our strategy moving forward. And then also market share. You want to make sure you're opening stores where your market share is low, and that will make sure that the net new sales, the total incremental sales benefit to the business is highest rather than cannibalising the fleet. Importantly, one of the more qualitative aspects is just socialising these gaps with stakeholders. The network plan and the gaps that form part of the network plan, it's really got to be a company document, because the gaps are going to inform how many new stores there are, how much capital is spent on those new stores, what the sales growth from new stores is going to be. So it has major implications on all aspects of the business. You know, the sales coming from new stores influences how many more products we need to be, you know, buying in the merchandise category, how many more employees we need to have from an operational sense. So this is something that has to be signed off by the absolute highest levels of the Coles board and executive leadership team. And once they've signed it off and approved it, the property leadership team oversee it, and they're those members that I mentioned before, whether it be retail property, investment management, property finance, property legal, everyone sort of owns this document and contributes towards it. The leasing, development and acquisitions teams are the ones who deliver it. And it's of course socialised with external stakeholders, and they might come to us and say, hey, we've got a shopping centre, do you want to be here? But we can also go to them and say, well, here's where we want to be. Would you think about building a shopping centre there? So it works both ways, and that's why it helps to have a plan and be able to proliferate it. And of course, in terms of proliferating it, we want to upload it to our database, which is a very extensive Microsoft SQL Server database, which can then flow through to all of our Excel tools, and we put it on our SharePoint in an Excel format for the property team to be able to access. If they go into the SharePoint and click on the network plan, you can either get it in a Excel file and filter it by state, filter it by gap priority. Some gaps are A gaps, B gaps, C gaps. Some gaps are needing to be delivered in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. You can filter the spreadsheet in all of those different ways to really hone in on a particular type of gap. And then, of course, GIS and mapping is a really great way to convey and easily visualise the network plan, so people can look at it and say, right, I know we need, you know, we've got several gaps in that part of Victoria, so I'm going to go out to a well-known landlord or developer in that part of the world and ask them what their current growth plans are there. So that's just a way of how we push it out to the rest of the property team and make sure that it's accessible to those who need it. So that's a step-by-step process as to how we devise a network plan and some of the considerations that go into it. I might stop there for today, because the rest can quite easily form part of next week's lecture, and it can also tie into a bit more of a discussion about theory, which will be the focus next week.
Yeah, I think this is a good point to stop and invite some questions or discussions.
Yeah, happily. And we'll have a chat a little bit at the workshop too.
What is the most challenging bit of creating the network plan, Toby?
Well, we might need to stop the recording here, but pulling it together is quite fine. It's data driven and it's objective. You know, there are locations where objectively the population is growing. Objectively, we have a low market share. Objectively, you know, the affluence is high. So actually identifying the gaps is quite straightforward. I think the challenge is really the deliverability of the gaps. So once they're circulated, we have a lot of debates with internal stakeholders about, is this really a gap? We can't open a store there, so why don't we try and go to the town across? So I think it's the more practical and deliverable aspects of delivering the network plan that's hard. It's hard to get buy-in from every single team, because, like I said, we will rarely remove a gap, because fundamentally it is a gap in our network. But if it's not deliverable for a variety of reasons, it's very frustrating for the property team to have it as a gap, because they're saying, and all the feedback is, it's very difficult to deliver the gap. So I think the socialisation of the gaps with stakeholders is a challenging part. And sometimes you can have a gap, but when it comes to actually pulling it together from a financial feasibility perspective, you can have a site and we can put sales on it, but sometimes it just won't stack up. So not all gaps end up being 100% viable from a financial feasibility perspective, but it is still a gap based on all of the metrics that we have put forward.
Yeah.
So I think it's the deliverability part which is the hardest, but that's to be expected, and it just prompts robust debate between the location planning team and the property team. And I guess one thing to mention is that the location planning team is judged on their network plan and their sales forecasting and their accuracy, whereas the property team is typically measured on their number of stores approved and open. So there's a bit of a tension there between the interests of those two teams, but it's a predominantly healthy one, and enables us to have good debates and understand where the property team comes from, and they can understand where we can come from. So that's how it usually plays out.
Makes a lot more sense. While we are waiting for questions to come from other participants, I think I would like to ask something that I and Godwin were discussing earlier about allocating weights to different variables. We understand that there could be very nuanced methods to do so. So is there any particular strategy that you are planning to adopt when we do the workshops, or how do you think the weights are designed or the scores are designed?
Well, typically it will be informed by an existing fleet, which we have, and we can look at our 800 stores and we can make some general conclusions about what variables contribute towards store success and which ones have a higher R-squared value. We know that correlation doesn't always equal causation, but for the sake of this exercise, we are pretty focused on those variables that lend themselves to higher sales and do so with a high degree of confidence. So there's a bit of statistical regression and hedonic modelling that's done to confirm the efficacy or the validity of those variables. And then it's really up to the individuals who are doing it to place the weightings. So you can do it very easily in Excel so that it's dynamic and make it so that, if we were wanting to roll out a format like BILO, which was more focused on a value customer, we wouldn't have a high CIFA score here. We'd have a lower one, and we'd be weighting locations with a 700 to sort of 800 CIFA score at 3. So that's probably more of the art to it rather than the science. The art is when you're weighting those variables, you've just got to have a holistic view and understand, by weighting the variable this way, what are you giving more emphasis to, and is this going to really bring out what you need from a demographic sense for your store to succeed. Like I mentioned baby bunting before, you would want to weight something like family structure and age structure highly, because that is so integral to your store's success. Whereas if you've got population density and population growth as the higher weighted items for baby bunting, it's good and you're going to get a general sense, but it's going to overpower the more important ones that are specific to your retailer's success.
Yeah, makes sense. I'll let others ask questions rather than consuming all your time.
Toby, can I ask a quick question? just in terms of when you're creating or wanting to produce another store to add into the existing fleet, have you ever added in a store and it's negatively impacted on the sales of an existing store or surrounding stores that you've actually had to, well, not shut down the new store, but I guess rethink it?
Yeah. So, yeah, it's a good question, and it does play on our minds a lot at the feasibility stage, because if the new store does primarily source its sales from existing stores, it's not going to stack up financially, because there's not an incremental benefit to Coles. All we're doing is taking sales from one place and bringing them to another. We've already got them, and you're spending a lot of money to build a new store to do that. So typically stores that rely on doing that don't prevail, don't get past the feasibility stage. There has to be that obvious incremental benefit. But in the cases where, you know, that occurs and it's got a decent portion of new sales versus also some existing sales from impacting other stores, I'm not aware of a situation where it's been a complete disaster, because when you're bringing a new offer and sourcing it from existing stores, you wouldn't open 2 new stores in quick succession. If you're bringing a new store in, it's going to be new compared to the other ones, and you will typically be able to pull that across. It's just as long as you're not pulling too much across, so that it's just sort of churning existing sales, that is the main focus. So I guess that's a convoluted and not overly clear way of explaining it, but fundamentally you have to have a reasonably high proportion of new sales for a store to succeed. And when that does occur, we're fairly confident that the sales that are brought across will be brought across, because we're bringing something new and better to the catchment.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much.
So maybe we close the session here, and then this will also give us time to think of more questions when we meet again for the workshop in another 1 hour. Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining, and look forward to seeing you again in some time. Thank you so much, Toby, for giving your time. And you are not, we are not letting you go as of now. So we still hold you for 1 more hour in the workshop. See you again then.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.